Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Ghost in the Attic by Mark Allan Gunnells. Now, Ghost in the Attic is a collection of short stories that was published in 2011. Now, Mark Allan Gunnells is actually a personal friend of mine, and I've actually had him take part in a few of the reviews I've done in the past. Like, my review on Jaws had a little mini review that he did put in the middle of that video. The same with my review on the Blair Witch Project. I had him do a little mini review on that movie, and I put that in the middle of that video as well. And I've reviewed several of Mark Allan Gunnells' books in the past. Now, as is the case with most short story collections when I review them, I'm going to be reviewing each story in this collection individually. Now, the first story in this collection is titled 911, and this is perhaps my favorite story in the entire collection, and I think this is one of Mark Allan Gunnells' best stories. Now, the plot of this story is it follows this woman who used to be a 911 operator. That was until she was actually on the phone with somebody who was in one of the Twin Towers on September 11th when the planes hit the towers, and she actually heard this man die over the phone. And now she's being haunted by the ghost of this man. Now, 911 was an excellent story. As I mentioned before, I think this is one of Mark Allan Gunnells' best stories, and it's a very emotionally powerful story, and I don't want to say it's necessarily a horror story, but it is a really sad story, though. And apparently this was actually a pretty difficult story for Mark Allan Gunnells to write, and he actually told me that after he wrote this story, he was just emotionally numb, and I could definitely see that. Once again, it is a very emotional story, but I think it's the best story in this entire collection, and it's one of Mark Allan Gunnells' best stories in general. The second story in the collection is titled Seed, and this one is kind of playing on that whole childhood myth that if you swallow a watermelon seed, a watermelon would actually grow inside your stomach. And Mark Allan Gunnells takes this childhood myth and uses it as a really clever, albeit a little on-the-nose, allegory for teen pregnancy. Basically, the plot of the story is it's about this 16-year-old girl who swallows a watermelon seed on a dare from her boyfriend, and now a watermelon is growing inside her stomach, and she's trying to hide this at school and hide it from her parents or her mother, and it's a really, really good story. It's a really entertaining story. My only real criticism is that I do think the allegory, it's a little on the nose, but that's not really a criticism. Overall, it's a really entertaining story, and I highly recommend it. The next story in the collection is titled A Hell of a Deal, and this is about this woman who sells her soul to Satan so she could become the best singer in the world. This is a really good story, and the story itself is kind of a criticism of the music industry and how shallow the music industry really is. And one thing I really liked about this story is I liked how the devil in this story is not portrayed as necessarily being evil. Like, he's a much more sympathetic Satan, I think, and he's actually compassionate to the main character of this story, even by the end of the story. And one thing I thought was really interesting is the main character of this story, her name is actually Lisa, and that reminded me of an old Mario Bava film called Lisa and the Devil. The next story in the collection is titled The Delivery Boy, and this is about this guy who is constantly being harassed by this delivery boy who's given him all these pizzas, even though he didn't order any pizzas, and the delivery boy is constantly telling him that he owes him money, even though, once again, this guy did not order these pizzas. It's a really fun story, and a really funny story as well, and I might potentially do a short film based on this story. I'm not sure yet, but this is a really good story, and I definitely definitely recommend it if you get this collection. The next story in the collection is titled Wasted on the Young, and this is about this old man who owns this bookstore, and this nerdy 14-year-old kid is constantly coming into the store, and at first the old man kind of likes him and kind of feels bad for him because it's clear this kid doesn't have any friends, but as the story goes on, he starts to get really kind of annoyed by this kid, and he feels like this kid is really wasting his youth by just reading all these books all the time and not going out and hanging out with friends. And that's all I want to say about the story, and there is a nice little horror twist at the end of the story that I don't want to give away. But this is a really good story, and I definitely recommend it. The next story in the collection is titled Perry Davis Makes a Comeback, and this one was a really entertaining story. Basically, it's about this actor who died a year prior to the events of this story, and he was a very famous actor, and now they're doing a biopic on his life, and this guy gets casted to play this actor, and this guy who's casted as the actor is really not one of the best actors in the world, so the ghost of this actor, Perry Davis, comes back to haunt him to try to convince him to not take this role. And once again, it's a very funny story, but the ending of the story is actually really, really dark, and I will say that I felt like the ending of this story, like, it didn't really match the rest of the tone of the story, because most of the story is pretty lighthearted, but the ending is really, really dark. But overall, it's a really good story. And one thing I really liked about this is there's a little connection to Mark Allan Gunnells' novel Sequel, because one of the same characters from Sequel shows up in this short story. And I'm actually not sure if this story was written before or after Sequel. The next story in the collection is titled The Ghost of Winnie Davis Hall, and this one is about this college professor who meets this ghost who is haunting the college campus that he works at, and that's all I want to say about this story, but this is sort of a different take on the ghost story, but this is a really good story though. The next story in the collection is titled Revolution of Sound, and I'll be honest, this one was one of my least favorite stories in the collection. Basically, it's about these two teenage girls who aren't very popular, like, they're sort of like social outcasts, and there's this band that they really like that's actually a band from the 70s, and they go to one of this band's concerts, and really, that's all I want to say about the plot, because saying too much about the plot will really give it away, and I don't want to do that. Even though this was one of my least favorite stories in the collection, I still don't want to give away, like, the twist ending or anything like that, but, yeah, this one, it was okay. Like, I didn't hate it, it just, this one didn't really work for me like the other stories did. The next story in the collection is titled Circular, and this one, I'll also be honest, along with Revolution of Sound, is my second least favorite story in this collection. Once again, it's not bad, it's just, it's not like one of my favorite stories though, and it didn't grab me as much as the other stories did. But this one, it's about this couple whose daughter previously died, and they go to the cemetery where their daughter is buried, and they're trying to resurrect their daughter. That's all I want to say about this story. Once again, it's okay, but it wasn't great, at least not in my opinion. The next story in the collection is titled A Stranger Comes to Lipscomb Street, and this one was really, really good. And this is sort of a unique take on the werewolf story. Basically, it's about this guy who sees a naked man outside his house, and that's all I want to say about the story. But once again, it's sort of a really unique take on the werewolf myth. And it's also also a surprisingly touching story as well. The next story in the collection is titled Finders Keepers, and this one is sort of an example of what I guess you can call magical realism, where it's set in what appears to be the real world, yet it's set in a world where magic exists and people know about magic, yet they don't treat it as magic, they treat it as an average everyday thing. Like, that's basically what magical realism is, and this story is sort of a magical realism story. But basically this story, it's about somebody who finds something in the trash, something living, and this person is now trying to nurse what they found in the trash back to health, and that's all I want to say about the story. The next story in the collection is titled A Stroll Down Grace Street at Twilight, and this is about this old man who's going for a walk, and basically some really bizarre things start happening as he's going for this walk. But this one was a really good story, and if you get this collection, I definitely recommend it. The next story in the collection is titled The Moon in a Ziploc Baggie, and this one is also kind of like the story Finders Keepers is sort of an example of magical realism, and Mark Allan Gunnells actually said that he got a lot of inspiration for this story from the stories of Neil Gaiman. But basically, this is kind of a love story about a guy who literally gets the moon for his girlfriend, and that's all I want to say about the story. But this is a really fun story, and a really touching story as well. And the final story in the collection is titled A Boy Named October, and this one is about this young boy who's always picked on, and he's going to this cemetery where his parents are buried to find solitude, and he ends up meeting a friend there. That's all I want to say about the story, but this one was pretty good. It's basically sort of like a coming-of-age story, and it's short, sweet, and to the point, and it's a pretty good story. It's not one of my favorites in the collection, but it is pretty good. But yeah, that was my review on my friend's collection, The Ghost in the Attic, and I highly recommend getting this collection because even though I didn't like two of the stories in this collection, the other stories in this book are very, very good, especially the first story, 911, and I highly recommend this book. And also, all the stories in this book are pretty short. Like, you could read them in really, like, you could probably finish this whole book in an hour if you really worked at it. And once again, it's a really good collection of short stories. I didn't like two of the stories, but the other stories are very well done and very well written. So that was my review on Ghost in the Attic by Mark Allan Gunnells, and bye.